as I read this paper, it suddenly dawned on me that this is a perfect metaphor for me as an organizational psychologist, because we spend an inordinate amount of time thinking and talking like professions we have never held, right? Like occupations we were never trained in. So think about how much time you spend in your life preaching, right? You've already found the truth and your job is to proselytize it. Prosecuting, you find somebody who you think is wrong and your job is to prove it and win your case or come out ahead in the argument. And politicking, where you think, okay, I've got a base of people who I'm trying to curry favor with, and so I've got to campaign for their approval and support. And what I started realizing as I was actually about halfway through writing Think Again, I realized it needed an organizing framework. And so much of what I was trying to encourage people to do was about getting out of the mode of preaching, prosecuting, and politicking and into the mode of thinking more like a scientist. And part of the reason that I wanted to do that is I think that, the danger of preaching and prosecuting is that you don't change your mind, right? You're right. Everyone else is wrong. And so you might be very motivated to get other people to rethink, but your views are frozen. They're set in stone. And politicking is interesting because when we're being political, we're actually more flexible, right? We might even flip-flop, but we're doing it at the wrong times and we're doing it for the wrong reasons because we're just doing it to appease our tribe as opposed to doing it to find the truth. And so I think we could all get better at thinking more like scientists to say, you know what? Your views, they're actually just theories, right? You could kind of make them into hypotheses. And then you could run little experiments in your life to figure out whether they're true or false. And that should leave you not only more mentally flexible, but also more likely to change your mind at the right times for the right reasons.
Can you tell us in your own words how you came to write about rethinking?
This is such a hard question to answer because everything I want to say, I'm tempted to rethink. So we're going to have to question a lot of what I say here. I think in some ways, I really started thinking deliberately about it when I just had experience after experience of going into a new organization. And, usually I'd either give a keynote speech or the CEO or founder would reach out for some advising. And I'd start to walk through the evidence on whatever their question was. And more often than not, I'd get answers like, well, that won't work around here. Or that's not how we've always done things. And at some point, I just started saying, BlackBerry, Blockbuster, Kodak, Sears, should I keep going? And it was both surprising and mildly annoying to me that the very people who had called me because they thought I could help them rethink their vision, their culture, their strategy, were closed to the best evidence I could find. And I got really curious about why that was. And then I saw a lot of the same thing with my students, where they'd come in completely locked into being investment bankers. I've had enough students regret that path that I've spotted some of the warning signs that somebody might not find nirvana going down that road. And I'd try to encourage them to reconsider. And I got the same resistance. And anytime I see a 21-year-old and a 61-year-old grapple with the same exact problem, I think there's something really important and interesting to explore. So here we are.
Yeah, definitely. We always it's easy to see that other people should rethink things. Like we're looking at them going like, oh, that's Blockbuster. They should have rethought that, or they should be rethinking that. It's really hard for us to rethink ourselves. Why is that?
I think there are probably multiple reasons for it, but I think two of the reasons why people are really hesitant to rethink things are, one, it makes the world feel much more unpredictable. If my views aren't fixed, then who am I? And how do I navigate a really confusing and often turbulent world? And two, it makes me feel like I am not an expert, right? And a lot of us take pride in our knowledge. We feel like it's, when I think about power, there's a classic French and Raven framework where they said, look, there's expert power. There's what's called referent power, which is basically being liked and respect. And then there's coercive reward and legitimate power. And most of the bases of power that people have in life come from a position that they happen to hold, right? So my ability to reward you or punish you, my ability to get you to listen to me because I have a role of authority is not something I can carry with me. And so the knowledge I have is one of the few things that I get to hold on to. And the idea that that might be fragile, it not only questions my identity, it also, I guess, questions my status and my standing in the world, which is something pretty uncomfortable to do.
Let's double click on that identity concept, because I think that you sort of said our views are almost tied to our identity, and that gets in the way sometimes.
Yeah, I think this is something I'm always puzzled by. And I feel like I see it in every field. So, there are professionals in almost every field who not only are interested in particular ways of being or particular practices, but they actually define themselves by living those practices. And so, you know this already, but when I was writing the book, I started thinking through, how terrible would the world be if some professions had not rethought some of their convictions. So imagine, for example, that you went to a doctor whose identity was to be a professional lobotomist, right? That would be extremely dangerous. And yet there was a time when a lot of physicians defined themselves by that method, by that set of tools. We've seen the same thing with police officers, right? Who identified themselves as the kinds of people who would stop and frisk, because you never know where a criminal could be. And we know from the evidence that just had horrendous effects, particularly when it comes to disproportionately arresting and prosecuting people of color, particularly Black people here in the U.S. I think we've had teachers and parents who identified with practices that were just highly ineffective and maybe even harmful, and I think that it's dangerous, right? I think that for me, an identity is not about what you believe; it's about what you value. And so I want to have a set of principles. For me, my highest values are generosity, excellence, integrity, and freedom. And I am completely flexible on the best ways to live those values. And so you might come tomorrow and tell me, you know what, the randomized controlled experiments that you do, the longitudinal studies you do, there's a fatal flaw in them, and there's a better way to be helpful and excellent at your job. And I would be skeptical because I believe in science, but I would be open to hearing the idea.
How did you get to that point? Like, how do we convince ourselves to attach our outcome to more of our values than our beliefs? Like, attach our identity to values and not beliefs. Like, that's a tricky path, isn't it?
Do you think so?
I don't know. Like, how do you? Well, it seems like it is. Otherwise, we'd just be rethinking all the time.
I mean, isn't that part of the fun of being human, though?
But
to me, rethinking it's code for learning, isn't it?
Well, it is, but we don't update our views very often. That's part of the issue, our own and others, right? It's hard to see it when we don't do it. It's really easy to see when others don't do it. But maybe we're 50-50, right? Like, how do we nudge that forward so it's like 70% of the time we're open to updating our views? And what is the process by which we update our views?
That's a great question. So the way that I've landed at thinking about this is to say, look, when you have a belief, you have two options. One is you can subject it to a rethinking cycle. The other is you can fall victim to an overconfidence cycle. So an overconfidence cycle is something we've all both committed and witnessed probably too many times. But the basic idea is we start by being proud of something that we think we know. And that leads us then to feel a lot of conviction. That kind of launches us into confirmation bias, where we look for information that confirms our expectations, as well as desirability bias, where we look for information that basically reinforces what we want to be true. And then we see what we expected to see and what we wanted to see, and we get validated, and that only makes us prouder of what we know and less open to rethinking. The rethinking cycle is very much the opposite. It starts for me with intellectual humility, which is about knowing what you don't know. So you no matter how much of an expert you are in a given field or a given topic, you have a long list of things that you're clueless about. And being aware of what your ignorance is leads you to doubt your convictions. It makes you curious about what you don't know, and that opens your mind to new discoveries. And then every time you learn something new, it's not this sign that, oh, now I'm an expert. It's this sense that, Well, there's so much more to learn, right? And I've made a tiny, tiny dot of progress in, a whole universe of knowledge. And I can't wait to see what I learn next. And so I think one of the things we need to do is we need to give ourselves permission to enter rethinking cycles. And there are a lot of ways to do that we could talk about. But Shane, I'm going to ask you about this because a couple years ago, you wrote a post about how we should have more second thoughts. And I had literally started writing about that. I think it must have come out around the time that I was writing the Think Again book proposal. And I had proposed a tentative title for this book as Second Thoughts. I was like, this is amazing. You're on the exact same wavelength as me. And this is what you do for a living, right? You rethink things. You also ask the Farnham Street community and your whole audience here at the Knowledge Project to rethink a lot of their convictions. So where do you start your rethinking cycles? And how do you know when it's time to enter one?
I think I've just summed this up as outcome over ego. And so I usually try to wrap my outcome or wrap my sense of identity or ego in the outcome. And that's something I learned when I was working for the intelligence agency, right? It wasn't about me having the best idea. It was who's got the best idea, because that's going to get the best outcome. And then you sort of grow up in an environment where that becomes, I would say, the norm by and large. It's hard in a knowledge environment though, right? Because you have so much of your worth. You want to contribute to something. I think there's a biological need to contribute to something larger than us. And if your identity, you're not mechanically making something, you can't see, there's nothing tangible to what you're producing, then you effectively are a knowledge worker in one way or another, and then you're paid for your judgment. So if your judgment isn't right, what is it? And then what you do is you force your way, right? You don't intentionally sabotage other people, but you only look for confirming evidence. You're not open to changing your mind because your sense of identity is tied to being right, because that's how you contribute to the organization.
It's interesting, but not at all surprising to me that you really learned this in the intelligence community, because the way you're describing your process of rethinking is exactly what I learned from studying Superforcasters, right? Which is they will often come in to making a judgment and say, okay, the only way to have a better shot at getting right, or excuse me, the only way to have a better shot at being right is to recognize all the places where I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And I love this practice in particular that came from one of the Superforcasters in the book, Jean-Pierre Begam, who, when he forms a tentative opinion, will actually make a list of the conditions under which he would change his mind. And I've actually started doing this over the past few months, because I don't want to get locked into something that was, maybe sort of a soothing belief, but ultimately one that's not going to serve me well.
We used to do that too. We used to sort of track, here are the key variables that are going to drive this, and here's the range at which we expect those variables. And the moment they go outside of that range, it triggers a rethinking, if you will, of, oh, maybe we're wrong. Maybe we got this wrong. And now we can course correct. And the earlier we can course correct, A, the less costly it is, and B, the more likely we're going to be correct in the ultimate outcome. And that's what we were focused on, is not the... when you're dealing with what we were dealing with, you want the ultimate outcome to be successful.
Yeah, I love the way that you capture how important it is to be clear up front, right, about those ranges, because it is so easy and frankly so human, right, to move the goalposts.
Well, that's what we noticed, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about it and we didn't codify it in a way that everybody could sort of present or use as a reference, we move the goalposts all the times. It's just human nature, right? It's oh, well, that's easy to explain away. That's easy to explain away. But when you actually codify it, you give everybody on the team power to sort of talk about it and bring it up and be oh, this doesn't make sense anymore. What's going on here? Because we never thought this would happen.
This is interesting to me in part because one of the many reasons I was looking forward to this conversation is you're one of the best rethinkers I know. And I think there's in the world of thought leaders, I think there's a premium on being an explainer, right? I constantly am getting articles that are labeled as, this is an explainer on this topic.
Yeah.
And I'm always hearing, right, whether it's a podcaster or a TED talker or an author, oh, this person is a great explainer. And I'm not nearly as drawn to that as I am to someone being a great rethinker, right? Somebody who I know is going to invite me to rethink something that I've believed and actually get me excited about doing that, as opposed to either shutting down completely or being reluctant to do it. Yeah. And one of my biggest fears when somebody who excels at this skill reads this book, and you're one of the first to read it, is I don't want you to agree with everything I've said, right? I'm trying to explain how rethinking happens, how we can do it more often and do it more effectively. And I am confident there are some things I got wrong, or things that I probably missed when I was writing the book. And I have a hunch that you've probably noticed many of those things. So can I push you to tell me what you disagreed with or what you think I should rethink?
Well, let's continue the conversation. I think we'll just naturally get into some pockets
Great.
of this.
I just wanted to make sure early on I planted a flag that said, Shane, tell me what I should rethink.
One thing I did want to point out, though, that Farnham Street, I mean, we sort of thought about this from the get-go, and the tagline is mastering the best of what other people have figured out. So then there's no sense of identity. Like I don't come up with anything. I just try to like talk to smart people like you all day, and I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Like, I think that'll work. And the ultimate utility is sort of, or the ultimate test of whether a theory works is not only does it predict the past, but it predicts the future, right? So what's the utility to it? And I think that when you think about it that way, you don't, man, I can listen to Adam today, and then tomorrow somebody can come up with a better idea than Adam, and I'm not attached to that. And I know our relationship isn't attached to me sort of agreeing with you.
That's right. But I think you're probably underselling the value of what you deliver the way you just described that. Because I think part of what you do is you collect knowledge from other people and from many sources, right? But then you often extrapolate from that information in a way that actually helps people see, oh, and this is what I'm supposed to learn from it. And now I have an old belief that I can replace with a new one. Or I had kind of an intuitive framework that wasn't working for me, and now I have a much more effective and much more nuanced framework to work with. And I think that you're constantly giving people the tools to question themselves, and then to kind of, you're not just throwing out a bunch of ideas that need to be debunked, which I think a lot of thought leaders do. You're actually offering people something to improve them with.
I appreciate the generosity in that. I want to come to something you said about BlackBerry and Blockbuster. I was thinking, like these companies sort of hire you to help them rethink, but companies don't rethink anything. It's people that rethink things. And traditionally, consulting hasn't been about rethinking. It's about affirming something we already want to do and putting the shoulder of that externally somehow.
Yeah, and this is why I'm a terrible consultant and why I hate consulting, right? I've discovered over the past couple of years that I would much rather be an advisor than a consultant. Because I think as a consultant, to your point, too often people have already decided on a decision or a plan, or leaders want to convince their board of directors that, that they brought in an outsider to explore alternatives. And then having done lip service to whatever the issue was, they basically say, all right, we checked the box. Now our work here is done. And what I want to do is I really want to encourage people to challenge their own thinking, right? And to consider possibilities they hadn't really thought through or given credence to before. And so I feel like as an advisor, what I often get to do is say, look, my job here is not to tell you what the answer is. My job is to introduce you to new questions, right? And what I want to do is I want to hold up a mirror so that you can see your own problems more clearly. And once you do, you're in a much better position to solve them than I am. And in that process, one of the things I keep learning the hard way is even when I think I have a pretty strong recommendation, I often either sell it too early or I haven't tailored it enough to the world that the person is in. And so what I've tried to shift to over the years, and it's frankly the same thing that I've tried to do in office hours, is to say, all right, Shane, tell me why you're here. Why did you call me? I'm happy to share with you whatever I know on this topic. And then what I would love to hear from you is, what do you want to do with that information?
I think that's a really good approach. One thing that I'm struggling with is, how do you balance this notion of, okay, we don't know everything. There's a lot of uncertainty in what we're doing. I'm open to rethinking it, but I need to take action and I need to do something. And then you have an escalation of commitment the more action you take, which it becomes harder and harder to rethink. You have these sunk costs building up. You have other sort of escalations. How do you balance those two things between being open and also affording yourself the choices that you need to make to exist in an organization and seize opportunity?
I don't know that there's a way to get the best of both worlds in every situation. I do think, though, that you can create conditions that at least increase the probability that you end up both open and decisive. at the same time, which is a sort of strange combination. So for me, that's really about changing the way that we reward people. So in too many organizations, people are basically counted as successful if they get a good result and failed if they get a bad result. And the problem is it often takes years to find out what the results were. It's very easy for people to persist with a failing project for a long time and convince themselves and everyone else around them that, that they're on the right path. And so what a lot of the research on this suggests is that we want to shift to process accountability, not just outcome accountability, and ask people to really think seriously about, okay, how would I know that this is a thorough and thoughtful decision process as opposed to one that's driven, purely by whim or intuition, and ends up being much more shallow. So I drew this little 2x2 that I've found helpful, where I cross the quality of the outcome with the quality of the process. And I think we need to stop rewarding good outcomes with bad processes, because that's just luck, right? That's kind of a boneheaded decision that happened to turn out well. And we need to start either celebrating or at least normalizing good processes with bad outcomes. Because if you have a very thorough process, let's say, for example, you're going to launch a new product, or you're going to even try to reinvent your culture a little bit, or you're trying to figure out, should we hire somebody or not? In all of those decisions, the common ingredient is you don't know what the outcome is going to be a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. What you do know, though, is that there are more systematic, more rigorous ways of evaluating the decision now. And so if you can score yourself on a set of benchmarks around, okay, was my process thorough? Then even if the outcome wasn't good, you could say, well, that was an experiment worth running, because that's part of how you become a learning organization. And I'm constantly shocked by how few people actually think this way. I'd love to see more.
How do you judge a process?
Well, what kind of process are we talking about? Are we talking about a decision-making process, for example?
Yeah, let's do that. Like, how do you walk through judging that and knowing that the outcome won't happen for years, but also knowing that you need to update the process as you go along to get better and better with incorporate new knowledge?
Great. All right. So let's take a specific kind of decision. So let's do a hiring decision, since that's easy to work with. So Shane, if you and I are going to make a hiring decision together,
I'm delegating to you for sure.
No, you shouldn't. What you want is for me to weigh in on how to design the process, and you want to be the one that implements it.
Okay.
But what I would do is I would start by saying, okay, most basic mistake that people make in these kinds of decisions is they don't consider criteria before looking at candidates. Right. So they interview their 3 people and they start to compare them, as opposed to saying, no, I should have an independent standard for the skills and values that I'm trying to select on. And let's identify those really clearly. Let's not just do those from my opinion. Let's try to build some wisdom from a crowd here. And of course, not all crowds are equally wise. Right. So let's go to people who are knowledgeable about the key dimensions of our culture, the key challenges of the job. And then once we built out the criteria we're looking for, the next step is to say, okay, how do we rigorously and comprehensively assess people standing on those criteria? And, in a lot of cases, there's one interviewer. We know that it's better to go up to 3 or 4 empirically. In too many cases also, it's each interviewer's job to make an overall assessment of the candidate, which makes it too easy to decide you like someone, and then confirmation bias and desirability bias are basically driving the process. So what we do instead is we break this down and we say, okay, Shane, I'm looking for somebody who's a giver, not a taker. Your job when you meet this candidate is to solely assess them on that dimension and come back with your behavioral data on whether they fall more on the selfish or the generous end of that spectrum. And then we have someone else assessing their intellectual humility and curiosity. We have somebody else who's, maybe gauging their levels of integrity. And so nobody has a conviction about whether the overall candidate is good or not. They're building the pieces of the puzzle to say, okay, does this person meet our criteria? And then after that's done, we would then come together and say, okay, now let's make an overall judgment, having pooled all of our knowledge, right? That's a thorough process, and it's very different from how most organizations hire.
Well, why is it so different from what most people do? Just because it's time consuming and...
I think it's less about the time and more about the gospel of intuition. I think that too many hiring managers are afraid that if they essentially delegate, I mean, this is a more algorithmic approach to decision making, right? If I delegate my knowledge and my experience to what feels more like a formula, then maybe I'm out of a job, and maybe also my superior intuition my gut feeling about a candidate is going to get ignored, and that's what I've hung my hat on for a lot of my career. I also think it's boring, right? So managers love having the freedom and flexibility to go wherever the interview takes them. And, the idea of being much more structured in your interview process, of saying, okay, let's get a well-defined work sample. Let's, figure out if somebody says they're a good salesperson, let's actually ask them to sell us something. And let's compare all the candidates on the same selling task. It kind of reduces the variety that I get in my job. And I think those are a couple of the reasons why it's uncommon. But I think to your point, yeah, it's expensive, right? So it ultimately will require a bigger investment of time. It probably requires more people involved too. That time has an opportunity cost. And so maybe we feel like we're giving something up. I don't know about you. If I'm going to hire someone and commit to working with them, I cannot invest enough time up front to decide that that's a good choice.
It's interesting to me to listen to you say that, because what comes to mind is like there are organizations that invest incredible amounts of energy, time, money into this. There's sports organization, all sports, before they draft somebody, it's like, what is the person's character? How well do they recognize the plays? How well is it intuition versus professionalism on their part, right? And they have these ways of evaluating that. Special forces, the same thing. They're investing a lot in sort of determining these recruits. And why do you think they're so variable? Like it's hit or miss, right? Like they haven't cracked that code, if you will.
I think it's hit or miss for a few reasons. One is that we don't have all the criteria that we need. So, I've worked with a whole bunch of professional sports teams over the past few years on this exact problem. And they're at best assessing on, maybe 7 or 8 attributes when there might be 200 that are going to drive people's future performance, right? So I think that's the first problem. The second problem is the measures are extremely noisy. So it's one thing to say, okay, if I'm trying to hire if I want to draft somebody to play for the Toronto Raptors, right? I can figure out how tall they are. I can figure out how high they can jump. But when it comes to, quickness and diving for a loose ball, I can't measure that as precisely as I would like. And then I'm also trying to come up with a score for grit and generosity and humility. Good luck with that, right? They're very, very intangible factors to measure.
And then how you would weigh them would vary based on the individual candidate too, I would imagine, and team character and a whole bunch of other things.
The aggregation problem is huge. So I actually had this question posed by a sports team last year that was hiring a head coach. And they had used some of my assessments, and the question was, okay, we have 2 finalists. Do we go with the coach who scored higher in intelligence or the coach who was more of a giver? I don't know what the right answer to that is. I'm not at liberty to say, but the coach, they ended up choosing the coach with the higher intelligence score and firing that coach at the end of the season or shortly thereafter. And I don't know what the right answer is there, right? I think there's probably a threshold. I would not want a coach who's extremely selfish. I also wouldn't want a coach who's not, reasonably intelligent. But then when you get into the ranges of, well, anybody with these attributes could succeed. I don't know how to trade those off. And then to your other point, well, how are they going to gel with the culture of the team and with the players involved, right? Those are all open questions. And so this is a very messy problem.
Well, let's come out of this problem a little bit, and I'm going to hire you as an advisor. And how do I encourage my organization, the culture within the organization, that people they feel psychological safety, I guess. That's the core requirement to rethink as an individual, is like you feel it's not threatening to your identity. It's not going to have an impact on your job, your career. Nobody's going to hold it over your head. How do we encourage that how do we build psychological safety within an organization?
So Konstantinos Koudaferis and I just finished some studies on this exact topic. And we started from the premise of saying, look, if you're a leader and you want to build psychological safety, you want to give people the freedom to take risks and to know they won't be punished if they rethink something or they voice a problem that needs attention, then what most leaders think they should do is ask for feedback, because then the door is open. And we did find that CEOs who seek feedback more often had higher psychological safety in their top management teams. But we found that when we went and encouraged managers to go and ask for feedback, it didn't have a lasting effect on psychological safety. And it seems like a couple things broke down in our follow-up analyses. The first one was sometimes leaders and managers would ask for feedback, and then they didn't like what they heard and they got defensive, which immediately says, nope, guess the door is closed. The second problem was even when they were open to ideas, sometimes the feedback was irrelevant or it addressed areas that were outside their span of control. And so they said, okay, this is not a priority for me, or I can't do anything about it. And that led them to stop asking, and it led their employees also to stop giving and to stop speaking up because it seemed like an exercise in futility, right? So even if you took the fear away, that doesn't mean that I can have an impact if I raise an idea or I challenge my leader to rethink something. So we got curious about alternative approaches that might have a more lasting effect on psychological safety. And the one we tried out that worked effectively was instead of just asking for feedback, we actually had leaders criticize themselves out loud. In some cases, managers would bring in their performance review and they'd say to their team, hey, here's what my boss told me I need to work on. And I would love your input on whether I'm making progress in these areas. And not only did CEOs who did that naturally have higher psychological safety in their top management teams, but when we randomly assign managers to kind of criticize themselves as opposed to asking for criticism, just inviting them to do that once increased psychological safety in their teams for at least a year, which is a staggering effect. And there are a couple of things that happen that are really different from what happens when you just seek feedback. So one thing that happens when you criticize yourself is you show you can take it. And it makes people immediately less fearful about challenging you. The second thing that happened, which I think is in some ways even more interesting, is it created mutuality. There's now a dialogue that's going on where I've said, you know what, Shane, here are all the places where I stink and I really need your help in getting better. And you now not only have the freedom to tell me how I can improve, but you feel like you can be more vulnerable with me. And so we end up with there's basically a normalization of vulnerability that happens where, once I say, hey, I'm a work in progress, everybody on my team is more comfortable acknowledging that too. And it makes it easier too for the team to hold me accountable. So let's say, for example, I have a tendency to talk too much in meetings. And I come into my team and one day, instead of saying, hey, could you give me some feedback on our meetings? I say, I've realized I have a tendency to not shut up when I should. I would love you all to help me with this. Then 2 meetings later, I'm rambling, and that gives permission to my team to say, hey, you know how you said you wanted to talk less? Yeah, it hasn't happened yet, right? So then, what we saw is a lot of the teams work together to create practices for keeping the door open. They do a first 5 minutes of every meeting check-in. Is there anything anyone can do to improve? They'd hold a monthly vulnerability meeting in some cases where people would just talk about their development areas and their progress and where they were struggling. And I think that we could all be more open in criticizing ourselves. And I'm not saying, that every leader should stand up in front of the thousands of people who work below them and talk about all the things they're bad at. But I think with the core people that you work with, odds are they know what your weaknesses and shortcomings are anyway. And if you can own up to them, people are much more likely to help you rethink your ways of fixing those flaws.
I think the key word in everything you just said is they did it naturally. It wasn't a tactic. It was a behavior. It was part of who they were. And when it comes across as a tactic, it actually has the opposite impact, I would imagine. I don't know what the studies say, but I've been on the other side of this where leaders get up and they do their token, like, here's how I failed. And, there wasn't enough toilet paper in the bathroom and everybody's just like, oh my God, and it sort of backfires on the organization. But when it's a natural behavior and it's consistent and part of who you are and part of working together, then it has a different impact.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think there were, interestingly, in our study, there were some managers who came in a little reluctant, thinking, okay, I'm afraid that my employees are going to think I'm cherry picking the development areas that are actually strengths in disguise. And, or I'm worried that my team is going to say, well, why are you sharing this with us? And I think ironically, knowing that people might be a little bit on guard or a little bit suspicious actually led leaders to be more authentic and to come in and say, you know what, the whole reason that I'm going to talk about areas for growth is I want to get better. And so the more honest I can be about that, the more likely I am to grow.
And then if you see me wanting to get better, we want to hang out with people like us, and then it creates sort of a group cohesion about all of us are getting better and we're all helping each other get better. And by the way, we're all in the same problem working together. towards this common goal with this huge impact.
Yeah, I think it really changes the emotional experience of giving and receiving feedback and speaking up about problems and suggestions. Instead of, as a leader or manager, instead of feeling threatened, you actually feel like you're being coached, right?
Yeah.
Instead of feeling judged, you feel like you're being supported. And so I think it's the responsibility of people in power to open that door and keep it open, right? And this step to prove, right, here is the stuff people told me I am terrible at. Here's how I benefited from hearing those things in the past. That's one of the best ways that you can show that you really mean it.
I think when I asked this question about psychological safety, I actually presumed to know what some of those variables are, but maybe you can help. What are the variables that go into feeling safe psychologically, either at home, in a relationship with your spouse, or at work? Are they the same? Are they different? What are they? Talk to me about that.
So in the early research on psychological safety by Amy Edmondson and Bill Kahn and some of their colleagues, the two foundations were really trust and respect. And I think a lot of people, as Amy has pointed out, get psychological safety wrong. They think it's about being nice to everyone or being tolerant of everything or having no standards or not holding people accountable. No, it's none of those things. Psychological safety is knowing that other people are going to treat you with respect and trusting that if you go out on a limb and say something uncomfortable or challenge a deep-seated belief, that you are not going to be punished for that. And so I think the basic ingredients, right? Trust and respect, those matter in any relationship, right? Whether it's romantic or professional. And I think that one of the most basic mistakes people make on this is they forget that one of the most effective ways to earn trust is to show trust. And I think that's why I want leaders to begin with vulnerability, right? It doesn't, when you ask somebody for feedback, you are saying, hey, I respect you, right? Shane, I want your input. I want you to tell me what I should rethink in my book about rethinking. But if I don't criticize myself out loud, then you can't really trust that I'm going to listen to you and that I'm not going to bite your head off or get offended in some way, right? So I think I'd get a much more honest answer from you if instead of saying, hey, tell me what I should rethink, I came in and I said, you know what? I think one of the biggest mistakes I made in writing this book was I really understated the importance of preaching and prosecuting relative to being in scientist mode, which maybe is something we'll talk about. Maybe we won't. But once I say that, like, hey, you know what? I know this book is not perfect. I poured a lot of energy and time into it, but I really want to find out how I can evolve my thinking, and you're a great person to help me do that.
Let's talk about the preachers, prosecutors and politicians and scientists. Why don't you introduce that for us?
Yeah, so credit to Phil Tetlock for bringing this framework onto my radar. Phil wrote this amazing paper almost 20 years ago now, where he said, look, a lot of research on decision making and judgment assumes that people are thinking like hyper rational economists or scientists. And we're not, actually. We're much more social creatures than that. And as I read this paper, it suddenly dawned on me that this is a perfect metaphor for me as an organizational psychologist, because we spend an inordinate amount of time thinking and talking like professions we have never held, right? Like occupations we were never trained in. So think about how much time you spend in your life preaching, right? You've already found the truth and your job is to proselytize it. Prosecuting, you find somebody who you think is wrong and your job is to prove it and win your case or come out ahead in the argument. And politicking, where you think, okay, I've got a base of people who I'm trying to curry favor with, and so I've got to campaign for their approval and support. And what I started realizing as I was actually about halfway through writing Think Again, I realized it needed an organizing framework. And so much of what I was trying to encourage people to do was about getting out of the mode of preaching, prosecuting, and politicking and into the mode of thinking more like a scientist. And part of the reason that I wanted to do that is I think that, the danger of preaching and prosecuting is that you don't change your mind, right? You're right. Everyone else is wrong. And so you might be very motivated to get other people to rethink, but your views are frozen. They're set in stone. And politicking is interesting because when we're being political, we're actually more flexible, right? We might even flip-flop, but we're doing it at the wrong times and we're doing it for the wrong reasons because we're just doing it to appease our tribe as opposed to doing it to find the truth. And so I think we could all get better at thinking more like scientists to say, you know what, your views, they're actually just theories, right? You could kind of make them into hypotheses, and then you could run little experiments in your life to figure out whether they're true or false. And that should leave you not only more mentally flexible, but also more likely to change your mind at the right times for the right reasons.
If it's not a law of nature, like effectively, it's just a theory.
Exactly. Can you say that again and repeat it to approximately 8 billion people?
Yeah, I wish. If being a scientist is also like, in that case, would you want your identity sort of tied up with your profession a little bit? Because scientists are known to sort of think and change their mind and look for evidence. And so in that case, I mean, there is part of that you want.
Ooh, that is such an interesting reframing of my stance on identity. I think you might be right. I guess I would say, yeah, I don't see any problem with having identities, right? Having lots of identities. I think what matters is what values you attach to them.
Right.
So for me, seeing myself as a scientist, well, I should be more specific, seeing myself as a social scientist, right? And thinking about myself, seeing myself as someone who likes to think and talk scientifically and who was trained to do that. What that means to me is I value truth, and I am more interested in I'm more interested in getting the answer right than I am in being right. And that means lots of my opinions are still flexible, right? I have a set of tools. So I really like experiments. I really like doing, carefully constructed longitudinal studies. And I think those tools have been rigorously tested over centuries, right, as being the most valid and probably independently verifiable, or at least most difficult to falsify, right, techniques for reaching the truth, or at least getting closer to it. And I think as an identity, scientist is helpful because it reminds me how much we don't know and how hard it is to arrive at the truth or an approximation of it.
I want to preface my next sort of question with, I don't want to talk about politics. I don't want to talk about sort of liberal, Democrat, Republican, conservative, anything to do with that. What I want to hit at is, it seems that most of our leaders, we elect them for being strong-minded, clear-sighted, isn't that? And, often charismatic. Why are we drawn to these people if we know that actually maybe the best elected official would be the one that gets up and says, I don't know how to fix this. I would just hire the best people and listen to them. But we would never elect that person. Why do you think that is? Why are we drawn to this?
I don't know. I think we have elected that person. I don't think it happens that often, but I think that in the U.S., Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that was literally his campaign with the New Deal, right? It was a whole campaign to say, you know what, we're gonna run a bunch of trial and error experiments and learn from what works. I think it's hard for that person to get elected, though, because especially as we face crises and we grapple with uncertainty, we're drawn to people who we feel like are going to figure it out and going to fix it. And so if somebody hedges too much, if somebody shows too much humility, I think we mistake that as a sign of ignorance, right? And it's the basic trap that you've railed against for years, Shane, which is we should stop confusing confidence for competence, right? Just because somebody is sure of an opinion does not mean they actually know what they're talking about. And in fact, anybody who is familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect will know that the more sure people are of their opinions, the more hesitant we should be to listen to them, right? But there's something very intoxicating about following someone who believes they've already found the way. And I think it gives us a sense of coherence. It can give us a sense of purpose. It's easy to put our trust in people who have a clear vision. Of course, in the long run, those are the people that I worry most about because they're the ones who are most likely to get too attached to that vision and stick to it long past its time.
And I think it removes uncertainty too. Like it's sort of, oh, finally, I don't have to think about something. Somebody else has got a clear path forward, and therefore even if it's wrong. We would almost rather be wrong and certain than uncertain and land in the correct spot, because it like wreaks havoc on us.
That is a scary thought. I think it's true for a lot of people. And it makes me wonder if, at some level, you're right. It's a way of letting other people do your thinking for you. And this is why political parties have always been such a mystery to me. Like when people ask me what my politics are, I think for myself, I try to form independent opinions based on the information that I encounter. And the idea of identifying myself as a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or conservative, that's ridiculous to me, because it means I've outsourced my thinking to some group of people that I don't think are thinking very scientifically.
Let's talk about that without using politics, sort of, but like tribes. Like we fit into these groups. We want a sense of belonging. It's a very human thing to want to fit in with a group, be part of a group, have status within that group in a hierarchy. There's a biological sort of hierarchy need that we have. Even if we're lowest on the totem pole, we sort of like want to know where we stand in this pecking order. And then we assume group identities and group positions, and those are really hard. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think the idea that comes to mind right away here is these twin desires that human beings are constantly grappling with. We want to fit in. We also want to stand out. Right? We want belonging. We also want status. There's a theory that I love. Marilyn Brewer calls it optimal distinctiveness. And she says, look, there's a way to fit in and stand out at the same time. It's by joining unique groups. Because then you are part of something, and you're not only part of something, you're part of something that has a clear identity, because there are very few other groups like it. But you also stand out because of the very way that group has differentiated itself from others. And so if you can join a group that gives you that sense of optimal distinctiveness, if you can join a kind of an unusual group, or a group with clear, well-defined boundaries, then you're able to satisfy those motivations simultaneously. And I think that explains the rise of a lot of movements and a lot of groups, where people will say, okay, I want to belong somewhere where I also feel like, I'm not like everyone else. And I think that goes back to, that's how people gain a sense of predictability. It's how they have a sense of control in their lives. It's how they avoid feeling excluded. And frankly, the other function it serves is existential. Right. One of the most robust findings in psychology over the past 3 decades is that belonging to a unique group actually serves a terror management function, that it helps you avoid threats to your own mortality, or at least it makes you worry less about what might happen to you in the future, and whether you have a legacy. It connects you to something larger and more lasting than yourself. And so, it's easy to see why people are drawn to these groups. It's also a little bit scary.
Do you have to be contributing to that group for that effect to sort of hold, or can you just need to be a part of a group, like identify yourself as part of a group?
Turns out identification is enough.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And in fact, sometimes the identity doesn't even have to be earned, right? It has to be claimed. There's some Peter Gollwitzer work on how, if people can, it's a version of slacktivism, where if people can claim to be a vegan, only the people who they eat dinner with, right, will actually know if they're living it or not. And so there are situations in which going public with that identity actually prevents people from following through on it privately. That being said, I think the general effect in the literature is the opposite, right? When we're known for a particular identity, we tend not to only internalize it. We're then more likely to start to live it and want to contribute to that group.
Right.
Because that's who I am.
Making choices that are a step towards who you are. No, that makes sense. So we've talked about sort of the individual, but let's talk about how we change other people's minds. How do we change the views of other people, the people we work with, our partners? This is probably the part of the conversation everybody wants, because we're right. How do I change somebody else's views? How do I convince them that they're wrong and I'm right? Walk me through that.
Well, it helps to let go of that sense that you're right, and say, look, if this is a one-sided exchange and you're supposed to change your mind, but I get to stand still, we're probably not going to make a whole lot of progress here. Unless you are a very good prosecutor, or the other person is very happy to be preached to, which I think is all too rare when we get into persuasion challenges.
You might win the battle, but you'll lose the war.
Exactly. And I think it's a mistake to even see it as a war, right? Because
Yeah.
in a war, your job is to make sure you don't lose too many battles. And one of the more interesting things that psychologists have done when looking at, disagreement and debate is to say, what if we used a different metaphor? What if we thought about it as a dance? And I'm the worst person to use this metaphor because I cannot dance to save my life. My wife actually signed us up for dancing My wife signed us up for dancing lessons before our wedding, and she quit after the second one. I was so bad. She just decided it was hopeless. So, and Allison was 100% right on that, and I was very happy to be prosecuted for being incapable of rhythm. And it was not the first time I've been told that either. But there's something about dancing that says, look, we're both going to move, right? And it's, I think a good argument or, a good debate or a good disagreement is one where neither of us has really choreographed all the steps we're going to take. And sometimes we step forward and sometimes we step back. Other times we sidestep. But ultimately, we're actually trying to get in rhythm or in sync, which is a very different goal from trying to change somebody else's mind.
I think, that's a much better way to frame it. So what are the steps that we take for this dance then? Not only for sharing our opinion, but also receiving their opinion.
So one of my favorite ways to think about that is a classic study by Neil Rackham of expert negotiators, where he compared them both pre-negotiation and actually in the live negotiations to average negotiators to look at what the two groups did differently. And the experts, they spent far more time planning for and then talking about common ground was the first takeaway. So a lot of people, when they go to have an argument or win a debate, they think their job is basically to find the differences quickly so that then they can fix them, right? That's not at all where I want to start. I want to start by saying, Shane, let's identify areas that we agree on, which gets us in synchrony, right? And also says, hey, you know what? This is somebody who shares some of my values or maybe some of my views. And that I think that makes the conversation non-defensive and collaborative right from the start. Then a second difference that jumped out pretty clearly is the experts asked a lot more questions than the average negotiators. And they weren't leading questions. They were questions motivated by genuine curiosity. And I think that there are probably better and worse questions to ask here. So let's talk for a second about how versus why questions. So a lot of times when you discover that somebody has a different view from you, you naturally will say, well, why do you think that? And the problem is you're setting the other person up for confirmation bias. Right? You're giving them an invitation to make a list of compelling reasons that they themselves generated for why they're going to cling to their pre-existing convictions, right? So you're doing some of their work for them. What works much better what tend to be more effective are how questions, where instead of asking, why do you believe this? You ask, how would you implement this? Or how would that idea work if we were to come to some agreement on it? And I think you'll get a kick out of this. The classic studies on this are with mechanical and electronic objects. So you do these studies where you ask people like, Shane, can you explain to me right now how if you were to press a piano key, how does it make music?
I couldn't.
You can't. You're not even willing to try.
No,
this
is like you and dancing, man. This is just not going to happen.
So that's exactly where people land. Usually they take a little longer to get there. But interestingly, if you survey them on their confidence before and after they try to explain, their confidence goes down, right? Okay. If I just asked you, hey, how well do you understand how a piano works? A lot of people would say, pretty well. And then as you fumble through the explanation, you realize I do not have a clue. And I've pressed a piano key many times. I literally do not know the first thing about where that sound is coming from, right? And how the mechanics of it operate. And that cultivates intellectual humility, right? It's the term for it in psychology is the illusion of explanatory depth. And the idea is that people think they understand things much more than they actually do. And if you ask them to explain how, right? One version of that is just, how does this work? Another version of that question is, how would you explain that to an expert? Or, how would you implement that in the real world? They suddenly realize, gosh, I don't really know what I'm talking about. And this has recently been demonstrated for policy questions, where if you've got somebody who disagrees with you on, let's say, climate change or on tax laws, right? Instead of asking them why they believe what they believe, if you were to just ask them, well, how would you implement that tax law and what are all the effects it would have? Or how would you address this climate problem that I know there are a range of complicated solutions to? As they try to answer that, they realize how little they know. They become less polarized. They're much more open to hearing alternative views. And the hope is that you are too.
That's really interesting. I like that. And one of the other questions you had in the book, and maybe this applies here and it doesn't, is how do you know that? Which is like, where is this coming from? Like, where did this confidence come from that your position is correct? Like, did you read this in a headline, which you skimmed, or is this something you thought about? And I think part of the questions that you're asking there get into that level of depth and detail. And has this person actually thought about it? So if you're running an organization, those questions are great because you can't micromanage all these decisions, but how do you quickly test and discern not only people who know what they're talking about from people who don't know what they're talking about, but people you can trust from people you can't with a certain level of decision authority. One of the ways you can do that is just start asking them about how they're thinking about it. And in a level of detail that you're not trying to critique, you just want to hear them walk through it. And often people haven't thought about it.
I think that's exactly on point. And I think the tone really matters here, right? Well, how do you know?
Tone matters in everything.
A lot of curiosity.
Man, my mom used to say that to me all the time as a teenager. It's not what you said, it's how you said it.
It's one of those things that we all need to hear over and over again. And what I'm always looking for is, for somebody to exude curiosity when they ask the question, like, oh, that's so interesting. How do you know? Like, what led you to that belief? How did you land there?
Because then it's genuine. What I've always told people is just try to see the world through somebody else's eyes. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them. You just want to see and feel and like smell like what they're seeing and feeling and smelling. And that level of knowledge will help you understand them and understand where the common ground is to find win-wins.
I think that is so much easier in theory than in practice, though.
Oh, totally.
You probably know the Nick Epley experiments. There are 25 of them showing that on average, just encouraging people to take someone else's perspective did not make them more likely to understand the other person, and in some cases actually backfired. And that's in part because the more different somebody else's perspective is from ours, the more likely we are to just invent an explanation or a story that strays very far from the truth. So the received wisdom here is that instead of perspective taking, we should actually shift to perspective seeking. Go out and find out what the person actually thinks, right? Ask them a bunch of questions, interview them, and you're much more likely to learn where their beliefs are coming from.
Yeah, I think that was sort of what I was getting at, right? Like, you don't want to just assume their perspective. You just want to see the world through their eyes, like legitimately see the world through their eyes. And that helps you understand them better. One of your pet peeves is feigned knowledge. I want you to talk to me about how you deal with this, because you must see it all the time, not only as a professor, but posturing in organizations. And how do you deal with this?
Yeah, it just...
Do you call people out on it? Do you?
It eats at the core of my soul when someone claims to know something that they don't. It's bigger than a pet peeve because it violates one of my core values as a scientist, which is to form views based on the best logic and evidence available. And I have not always dealt with this well. So the story that comes to mind is I was called by an investment bank some years ago, and they asked me to figure out how to motivate and retain their junior analysts and associates. So I did 2 months of research. I had experiments. I had longitudinal survey data, interviews, observations. I had lots of outside research as well as internal data. And I came back with 26 evidence-based recommendations. And I was presenting them. I think it was actually my first ever video conference I'd done. This was at least 7, maybe 8 years ago. And I'm presenting to the co-heads of investment banking. They're on multiple continents. And I think I was on about recommendation 5 or 6. And one of the co-heads interrupts me and he says, well, why don't we just pay them more? And if there is one recommendation that was not on my list of 26, it was to solve the problem with money because they had already thrown a lot of money at the problem. These people were already well paid, by which I mean overpaid. And if money were going to attract them and retain them, it already would have. And I'm embarrassed to say that my response at the time was, I've never seen a group of smart people act so dumb. That did not obviously accomplish a whole lot for me, right? Although they did tell me they got a kick out of it later because people don't normally talk to them that way. But I obviously, I wasn't reasoning with them anymore, right? I've had a habit sometimes of, I think of the mental modes other than scientist. The one that I spend the most time in is prosecutor mode, and I've been accused of being a logic bully from time to time. And I'd clearly, in this moment, gone from logic bully to playground bully. And I decided after that I wanted to be in scientist mode if somebody had feigned knowledge, right? If somebody claimed to know something that they didn't. And what would a scientist do? A scientist would be just riveted. Like, who is this person? How could they possibly believe these things? And what is it that would possibly change their mind? And so I wrote a little script for how I want to respond whenever somebody challenges my evidence or claims to know something that I think is false, which is just to get really curious and say, well, I wonder what evidence would change your mind? And I don't always remember to ask the question. I don't always get curious enough to really want to know. But in the situations where I've pulled it off, it has completely changed the tone of the conversation. And often what'll happen is the person will map out the kind of study they would find convincing. And now we're on my turf, right? Because I have a mental library of studies that I can then cite, and they're helping me figure out which kinds of data they would find compelling. It also, I find it really helpful because it refocuses the conversation in the realm of evidence as opposed to just opinion. Right. And so when I ask them to tell me what a well-designed study is going to look like, we can then agree on what valid methods are. And once I tell them what the findings are using their chosen methods, it's a lot harder for them to just have a knee-jerk objection. So I don't know that that's always the question to ask, but I think I decided after that experience that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it think. And the best thing you can do at the end of a conversation like that then is to invite the other person to help you rethink your approach and say, hey, Shane, you know what? I've actually done this now a couple of times in mid-conversation. I've just interrupted myself and said, you know what, Shane? I can tell that the case I'm making right now is just not getting through to you. You are not buying this even at all. And I don't want to make this mistake again. So if I go and give this pitch to somebody else, how would you approach it differently? And maybe that puts me in a better position to reason with you a different day or with a different person. The hope is I learned something from that conversation, and now we're arguing to learn as opposed to arguing to win.
I like that question a lot, right? Like, what information would be required to change your mind? But we often think of asking other people that. I think asking yourself that is an incredibly powerful question. And it can be done in private. You're not calling anybody out. You're not putting them on the spot. And I think often those conversations where you're challenging other people's knowledge and you have a hint that it might not be there are usually best done in private and not in public for those people listening. I think that'll backfire if you sort of like, oh, I'm going to make this person look like an idiot in front of everybody else. That just causes retaliation, tit for tat. You go nowhere. It doesn't help people. It just sort of cements them. Talk to me about this logic bully thing.
Well, I had a student some years ago now. Her name is Jamie, and she was trying to make a big career decision about whether to do an MBA, and if so, what school she should go to. I think she had been accepted at 2 schools. And I just said, Jamie, look, I'm not saying you shouldn't do an MBA, but let me give you all the reasons why I think it might be a waste of time and money. You already have an undergrad business degree. You don't need an MBA for any job that you want. And okay, maybe there's some firm that will tell you need it to get promoted, in which case I would say you probably shouldn't work at that firm because it's not like having an MD or a JD, right? There's not a codified body of knowledge that you need to run a business. There's no certification that says if you don't have an MBA, you all of a sudden can't fly this airplane, right? So I just went through a list of reasons why I thought she might want to rethink the decision, because I knew from she had taken a class with me years earlier and then come to office hours a lot. I knew her well enough to know that she was very concerned about status and prestige. And she was drawn to the credential because she thought it would give her credibility. And I just wanted her to think through carefully, was this a good use of time and money? And if you could take 2 years and $250,000, is there a better investment of that given your goals and your life circumstances? And I didn't have a stake in the outcome, but I argued the other side, as I often do. I guess she activated my prosecutor mode. And she came back and she said, "You're a logic bully." I was like, a what? And she said, "A logic bully." And she went on to tell me that I had overwhelmed her with rational arguments. And she didn't agree, but she couldn't fight back. And my first reaction, Shane, was, yes. Because I thought that was my job as a social scientist, right? I want to come with airtight logic and rigorous data and make the most compelling case I can to I guess at some level I was trying to destroy what I thought was shallow thinking. But what I was depriving her of was the opportunity to own her own choice, right? And to reason through this for herself. And so I've tried to get out of logic bully mode. And that same conversation I've had with a number of students now, and instead of listing all the reasons, I would say, all right, Jamie, can you tell me the pros and cons of doing an MBA versus not? Why are you excited about it? What are the risks? And then I go the extra step and say, and why are you coming to me? Are you here because you want my advice? Are you here because you're looking for my validation of a decision you've already made? Or are you here because you want me to challenge your thought process? And once I know what her goals are, it's a lot easier for me to invite her to rethink some of her assumptions without insulting her or causing her decision process to go haywire, or without making such strong arguments that she thinks I'm trying to give her an answer when I'm really just trying to test her thought process.
I like that. I think that I love that term, logic bully. And you think initially you're like, oh, this is so helpful. And then at the end, you're kind of like, oh, that wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I'm curious, how do you institute rethinking, or how do you help kids, not only students, but your own kids, rethink? Like, what are parents supposed to do at a young age for elementary school kids or high school kids and university students in terms of opening their mind to different possibilities, and what sort of things can we do?
So one of my favorite things that I learned while I was writing the book came from Wisconsin's Middle School Teacher of the Year, Erin McCarthy. What Erin does with her students is she gives them a section of a history textbook and she sends them out to rewrite it. And what they do is they look at primary sources, they interview people, and they realize how much information is missing from the way that we've narrated past events. And what that does is it allows them to think a little bit more when they encounter new information, like fact checkers, right? Where instead of, I read something in the news, or I heard it on TV, it must be true, to say, well, what are the sources of that information? And how do we really know? And I think we should all be lucky enough to have a project where we get to rewrite a section of a textbook. I thought that was a brilliant assignment. A variation on that we do occasionally at dinner is Allison and I, with our kids, will have a myth-busting discussion. I think originally it came about because our kids had learned interesting things at school that surprised us. Like one day, one of our daughters came home and said, we were just doing an Egypt unit. This was in elementary school. And I found out that King Tut probably did not die in a chariot accident. I was like, oh, that's so cool. That's not what I learned. What else are you learning in school that is different from what we thought was true at the time? And so it became sort of an occasional tradition for us to say, okay, who's going to bring a myth or a fun, surprising fact to the table? And what I want to do whenever we have these conversations is I want our kids to experience the joy of being wrong. To say it is such a delight to discover that something you thought was true was actually false, because now you've learned something.
I like that a lot. I'm still grappling with Pluto not being a planet, so I'm a little sad about
You and
this.
me both, Shane. I'm like, wait, I'm sorry. There are only 8 planets? Wait, why didn't we just extend the planetary boundary? Why can't we take the whole Kuiper Belt and call those planets too? This is not doing it. I begrudgingly accepted that planetary status is probably much more differences in degree than differences in kind, which is a difficult thing to swallow as a closet kind of astronomy nerd. But I think those kinds of moments, right? If you observe your own emotional reaction in them, like, why was I so upset when I found out that Pluto was not a planet? Why was declassifying the name of an object? The object hasn't changed, right? It's still floating out there. It's still somewhere in the same position that we thought it was. It doesn't affect my life in any material way. Why does this bother me so much? It's because I like to have a set of beliefs about the world that I can count on. And, when it comes to my understanding of the solar system, it's like I have a tower made out of Jenga blocks, and somebody just pulled out the wrong block, and now all of a sudden the whole tower is coming crashing down. And I want a much more solid and sturdy foundation for the things I believe.
What else do you do with your kids?
On the rethinking topic,
Yeah.
I was starting to think through like, we love to ski. Yeah. We really enjoy, we love water slides. We play word games. No, on rethinking, one of the other things that we realized a couple of years ago we weren't doing enough of was talking about, when it comes to teaching values, talking about how we had failed to sometimes live our values. So, Allison would often roll her eyes when I would talk to our kids about being givers, not takers. It's one thing to make that case. It's another thing to say, you know what, here's a time when I was not kind to somebody in my class who was being bullied. And I regret that, right? That was me failing to be a giver. And when I tell those stories, right, when I share mistakes I've made, when I talk about embarrassing decisions I've made, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to signal to our kids that it's okay to be wrong. And it's okay to rethink the choices we've made. That's, to me, one of the functions of regret, right? I think of most negative emotions as teachable moments.
Yeah.
And the whole point of experiencing them is you're supposed to learn something from what you did wrong so you can make it right in the future. And so much of regret is saying, okay, I did something that led to an undesirable outcome or that violated one of my values. And so how do I do this differently moving forward? Instead of trying to deny these emotions, let's actually listen to them and figure out what the lesson is.
You mentioned rewriting the history section was one of your favorite things that you learned. What's another favorite thing you learned when you were writing the book?
There's so many. Which domain, the individual, the interpersonal, or the collective?
Let's do collective.
On the collective side, I think, one of the things I just never thought about before was binary bias. So I knew I wanted to write a chapter about having charged conversations and how people could talk about the most divisive issues that many of us have just been shying away from because it feels hopeless. And I really came out rethinking my view that what we need to do is better understand the other side, which has been so much the political narrative. I think actually that's part of the problem, not the solution, because there is no charged issue that's ever simple enough to have only two sides.
Right.
And the research by Peter Coleman and his colleagues on this really opened my eyes to the fact that what we want to do is we want to complexify what seems like a spectrum. We want to complexify two categories into a spectrum, right? Anytime there's a binary, anytime there's a liberal versus conservative, or, I'll just use that as an example. Anytime you run into a binary, like, liberals and conservatives, you should picture a whole spectrum of beliefs there and say, well, there are relatively conservative and relatively liberal members of each of those groups. And if you break down the multiple issues, very few people agree with their party on all 16 or 17 of the major issues equally. And so if I can see the nuance there, and I can start to get people to think about, where in this very nuanced spectrum do I fall, then I see more shades of gray and less black and white in my beliefs. And so what I've been doing a lot now is catching myself in binary bias, right? Like I'm so glad in retrospect that give and take had three categories rather than two, because if there were only givers and takers, I would have missed the matchers, right? The people trading favors who actually are the most common at work. And I think that there are so many, this is relevant to any part of life, but it's something that runs across almost every project I've done in psychology, right? The best leaders are not the introverts or the extroverts on average. They're the ambiverts who fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum and are comfortable flexing and talking and listening. The most creative people are not the precrastinators like me who dive right in, or the procrastinators who wait till the last minute. They're the people who are quick to start but slow to finish, somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. And I think any spectrum that you draw, you can almost always find an advantage for being somewhere in the gray. And I think we should all do that more often.
That's flexibility and adaptability right there, right?
Bingo.
One of the stories from the book that I liked was Daniel Kahneman teaching you about how to respond to a surprise. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So I had this interesting experience with. I went to give a speech at a conference, and I didn't know a lot about who was going to be in the audience. And I get up on stage, and sitting in the audience is Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, one of the giants of our field. And of course, I was extra nervous. And afterward, I ran into him, and he said something like, "That was wonderful. I was wrong." And those two things don't normally go hand in hand, right? Either a talk was wonderful because you were right, or it was bad because you were wrong. And I just, I couldn't let go of it. My first reaction was to say, holy cow, Danny Kahneman liked something I said. My second reaction was to say, this is so strange that he thought it was wonderful to have been wrong. What's behind this? And so I ended up following up with him, and I asked him, why. I could literally, his face lit up when he talked about how exhilarating it was to be wrong. And he said, it's the only way I know I've learned something, right? If I find out I was wrong, it means I am now less wrong than I was before. And he really talked, he talked very eloquently about the value of detaching like we talked about, your opinions from your identities, your ideas from your identities, to say, look, every idea I have, it's just a hypothesis. Might be true, might be false. And if I have a vested interest in it being true, then I'm not going to discover as much as if I really want to find out if it's true or when it's true.
I think Bezos had something along these lines too, right? Where he's like, people who don't change their mind are wrong. So if you want to be right, you have to be somebody who changes your mind a lot.
Yeah, I think that it's been one of Amazon's persistent competitive advantages. Love them or hate them, right? They are extremely adaptable. And I've thought about this in terms of another 2x2. I met Jeff Bezos a few years ago, and I asked him how he goes about making hard decisions. And he said, okay, basically two questions. One is this decision reversible? And the other is, how consequential is it? How high are the stakes? And he's willing to act very quickly anytime a decision is reversible, because he can change his mind tomorrow, or low stakes, because it doesn't really matter. The decisions he puts off until the last possible minute, maybe even procrastinates on, are the ones that are both irreversible and consequential, because those are the ones that are not just gambles. They are not just experiments. Those are real commitments. And I think this is as relevant to personal decisions as it is to running a company, right? To say, okay, before I go into a major decision, if it is both irreversible and highly consequential, then I want to spend a lot of time rethinking my own views up front. Whereas if it's pretty easy to reverse and undo, or it doesn't really matter, I'm going to go forward and make the decision knowing I'll have time later and the opportunity later to second guess it.
But it's not enough to just sort of convince yourself you have the opportunity. You have to be of the mindset that that's sort of almost what you're looking to do. Did you learn anything else from Jeff or Amazon about how they make decisions? Because I think they're one of the best large organizations we've ever seen at collectively making decisions.
Yeah, I think one of the other smart things they do is they really take this idea of process accountability seriously. So if you ever go to a senior leadership meeting at Amazon, you'll see this sort of awkward experience of people sitting silently reading a memo for 15, 20, 30 minutes. And the reason they do that is they want everybody's thinking, careful, focused attention around what are the options for this big decisions, what are the alternatives around this big decision we have to make? And is the problem framed the right way? What's the long-term impact of this decision? And I think that it is so rare for a world of people who are, like, we all live in a world where we're too busy and we have too many distractions coming our way constantly. How unusual is it to sit down with a group of thoughtful people and read and reflect on a common document and then say, okay, what assumptions should we be rethinking here? And I would be thrilled to see more leaders adopt that practice.
I think it's brilliant because it doesn't assume people have read it before they come in. It gives people time to read it and discuss it One of the things I noticed when I was sort of running meetings like that is that people would come in and they would have read sort of like the first couple paragraphs because they didn't have time, not really their fault in some ways. And then they would signal that they've read the document by rephrasing some of those first, and everybody would just do the same thing. And I'm like, you're all just saying the same thing. Like, we can assume this is knowledge, but then you can't actually assume that people have read it. So I like the approach of sort of like distilling it down to something digestible, giving people time to get on the same page, allowing the time in the meeting. Most meetings don't need to be as long as they are anyway. And then everybody's talking from a common base.
Yeah, I think it's much more likely if you adopt that practice that people are actually learning. It's also, I can't think of a better time to do it than during a pandemic where we're all stretched for time. And now if I know the first at least 10, 15 minutes of a meeting are going to be processing time, that's one thing I've taken off my to-do list.
Yeah.
Right? I can actually do it during the meeting as opposed to trying to squeeze it in the night before.
And I like how it's not PowerPoint and it's actually like thinking instead of just point form convincing, I guess.
We could use more of that. There is a part of me that wonders whether, especially again for a high stakes, irreversible decision, do you want to send that out in advance? Encourage people to read it at least a first or second time and then really digest it again when you come together. Because I'm not sure, this goes back to that second thoughts post that you wrote. I'm not sure that our second thoughts are always our most insightful observations, right? They're usually the easiest ones to think of. And I worry a little bit that in the moment, sometimes people will react based on their initial intuition as opposed to, there's a twist on Danny Kahneman's work here that seems relevant, which is I worry a lot that we spend too much time listening to people who think fast and shallow and not enough time hearing people who think slow and deep. And I think we want to become the people who think slow and deep because that's where most of our good rethinking happens.
Yeah, totally. Matt Mullenweg said in episode 100, he basically puts a time on it. So it's like, we'll have the meeting, we'll discuss it, but then you have 48 hours to sort of like surface your thoughts. And that allows people who think slower or want to rethink the opportunity to sort of work through their own internal process and then contribute to the group process.
I like that practice a lot. I wonder how often people worry about being that guy. Right. Or that woman who's like, oh no, not again. 47 hours in to torpedo our decision. And now we have to go have another meeting about it.
Yeah, I don't know how often that happens. I want to end with sort of like this question that people say a lot in organizations, because I think you'll have a good response to this, is people say, I'm entitled to my opinion. And, that's their way of ending the conversation and saying, you can't change my mind on something. How do you respond to that?
I got this one just the other day, actually. I responded by sending the person who said that a copy of my book and saying, hey, I have a no. I think you are absolutely entitled, excuse me. Yeah, you're entitled to your own opinion. If you keep your opinion to yourself, if you decide to say it out loud, then I think you have a responsibility to be open to changing your mind in the face of better logic or stronger data. And so I think if you're willing to voice an opinion, you should also be willing to change that opinion. I think that's, of course, easier said than done, but I think it goes right back to something we talked about earlier, which is to say, okay, when would I change my mind? And if you can't answer that question, you are no longer thinking like a scientist. You have gone into preacher or prosecutor mode.
That's a perfect place to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Adam.